My name is Meredith Vance. I am 33 years old, and for the last 9 years, my family has introduced me to their elite circles as the quiet one who helps out with the family events. Last night, at the massive engagement gala for my younger brother, my mother pulled me into the industrial kitchen of the grand estate, handed me a white linen apron, and said, "Meredith, please don't mingle with the guests tonight. You look a bit washed out, and the Winston family is very particular about presentation. Just stay back here and make sure the silver stays polished." My sister-in-law-to-be, a woman whose father owns half the real estate in downtown Chicago, gave me a tight, pitying smile. My brother didn't even look up from his premium champagne flute. They wanted me out of the frame. They wanted the reliable, plain sister to remain invisible. What none of them knew, what they hadn't bothered to check, was that the high-end boutique catering company executing this entire 5-star event wasn't hired by my brother. It was owned by me. The heavy commercial trucks parked in the driveway bore a holding company logo that sits directly on my personal tax returns. And the elite chef managing the kitchen wasn't my brother's employee. He was my business partner. Welcome back to Silent Storm Stories, where the people left in the kitchen are usually the ones who own the building. If you've ever been pushed to the background by people who used your hard work to shine, do me a favor, drop a comment below and hit subscribe. Because tonight, the staff isn't just serving dinner. They are delivering the final bill. To understand how I ended up in a linen apron at my own brother's engagement gala, you have to understand the economy of the Vance family. My father owns a moderately successful architectural salvage firm. It's a good business, but it doesn't provide the level of luxury my mother desires. She has always been a woman obsessed with the optics of wealth. She speaks in an affected upper-class accent, collects vintage crystals she can barely afford, and measures the worth of her children by the status of the people they marry. My brother, Julian, was her masterpiece. He was handsome, loud, and entirely superficial. He went to a private business school, drove a leased European sports car, and spent his time networking at country clubs. I, on the other hand, was the quiet daughter. I inherited my grandfather's build, practical, sturdy, and his love for the culinary arts. While Julian was learning how to play golf with executives, I was working 16-hour days in culinary school, learning the exhausting, precise math of high-volume hospitality. When I graduated, my mother didn't throw a party. She simply looked at my degree and said, "Well, at least you'll always be able to help with Thanksgiving." And I did. For a decade, every family dinner, every charity brunch my mother hosted to maintain her social standing, and every corporate mixer for my father's firm was managed entirely by me. I designed the menus, prepped the food until my wrists ached, and cleaned the grease off the stoves long after the guests had driven away in their luxury cars. They never paid me. In our house, my labor was treated like a tax I owed them for being the less remarkable child. "Family helps family, Meredith," Julian would say, sliding his dirty plate into the sink while adjusting his silk tie. "Besides, it's good practice for you." I never argued. I am a woman who values silence. While they were busy performing wealth for their friends, I was quietly building a reality. 7 years ago, using a small inheritance from my maternal grandmother and a massive SBA loan that I signed for in the dead of winter, I bought a struggling commercial kitchen in the industrial district. I didn't tell my family, not because it was a secret, but because they never asked. If I wasn't cooking for them, my life was entirely uninteresting to them. I named the company Vanguard Hospitality. Within 5 years, through sheer, unyielding discipline, we became the premier secret weapon for the city's highest-end private events. We didn't do basic weddings. We did elite, confidential galas where the contracts started at $50,000. And then, Julian met Vivienne Winston. Vivienne Winston was the daughter of Arthur Winston, a real estate mogul whose name is stamped on 3 different skyscrapers in the city. The match was exactly what my mother had been praying for her entire life. The moment the engagement was announced, my mother's social media feed turned into a non-stop broadcast of luxury wedding planners, diamond viewings, and venue tour. The engagement gala was set to be held at the Winston family's private lakefront estate, a massive stone mansion surrounded by manicured topiary gardens. 3 weeks before the event, Julian called me. It wasn't a check-in. It was a demand. "Meredith, I need a massive favor," he said, his voice buzzing with that familiar, entitled energy. "Vivienne's mother wants this event to be perfect. They hired a premium catering firm called Vanguard Hospitality. It's costing us a fortune, and the Winston expectations are insane. I need you to come to the estate early on Saturday. You know how high-end staff can be lazy if they aren't watched. I need you to manage the setup and keep the workers in line so we don't look bad." I sat at my desk in the Vanguard corporate office, looking at the $50,000 event order on my computer screen bearing Julian's name and my mother's signature as guarantors. They had paid the 20% deposit using a credit card that I knew, from my father's accounting complaints, was near its limit. The remaining 80%, $40,000, was due the morning after the event. "You want me to supervise the staff?" I asked quietly, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Exactly," Julian said. "Just wear something dark and stay in the background. Vivienne's family doesn't need to see my sister running around with service trays. Just make sure the food is perfect. Don't embarrass us." "I understand," I replied. I didn't tell him that the contract he had signed contained a very strict, standard clause that I insert into every single Vanguard agreement. Any verbal abuse, degradation, or mistreatment of the catering staff by the hosting clients results in immediate termination of service, forfeiture of the deposit, and the immediate enforcement of the full balance. It was a standard protective measure I created for my employees. I never expected my own family to walk directly into it. On Saturday morning, I arrived at the Winston estate at 6 a.m. I wore my black utility trousers, my heavy service boots, and a plain black corporate polo shirt. My head chef, Marcus, a brilliant 6'4" culinary veteran covered in kitchen tattoos, was already directing the unloading of our refrigeration trucks. When my mother arrived at 11 a.m. to check the linens, she saw me carrying a heavy crate of imported crystal glassware up the stone steps. She looked around frantically, making sure Vivienne's mother wasn't nearby, and pulled me into the shade of the service tent. "Meredith, what are you doing?" she hissed, her face flushed under her wide-brimmed hat. "I told Julian you should stay inside the kitchen. You look like a delivery driver. If Arthur Winston sees my daughter hauling boxes like a laborer, it will ruin the narrative we've built." "The narrative?" I asked. "You know what I mean," she said, her voice dropping into that sharp, cold tone she reserved for me. "We told them you were a consultant, a corporate advisor. It sounds better than a cook. Now please go inside, put on the apron, and don't come out until the event is over." I looked at her for 5 long seconds. I looked at the lines of anxiety around her eyes, the desperate, exhausting fear of a woman who had spent her whole life pretending to be something she wasn't. "All right, Mom," I said softly. "I'll stay exactly where I belong." The reading of the will took place in the main boardroom of Vance Logistics. Marcus sat at the head of the table, already holding a gold pen. Chloe was checking her reflection in the polished mahogany wood. The family lawyer, a man named Sterling who had been on Marcus's payroll for a decade, cleared his throat and began to read. It went exactly as Marcus had planned. The real estate went to my mother. The 70% controlling shares of the corporation went directly to Marcus. Chloe received a lump sum trust of $200,000 for her artistic endeavors. And then came my name. To my granddaughter, Clara Vance, I leave my personal effects, including his vintage timepiece, and the sum of $10,000 to pursue her hobbies. Marcus didn't even try to hide his laugh. He leaned across the table and patted my arm. "You can buy a lot of graph paper with $10,000, kiddo. Don't worry, your job in the back office is safe. We still need someone to log the mileage." Chloe offered a tight, sympathetic smile, the kind you give to a stray dog you have no intention of feeding. I looked down at the silver watch. I didn't say a word. I stood up, tucked my chair in perfectly, and walked out of the room. What they didn't know was that the evening before, I had finally opened the secret compartment inside the back of that vintage watch. There was no key to a safe deposit box inside. There was something much better. A small piece of microfilm containing the private banking credentials to an unlisted corporate account in Switzerland. an account Marcus had been using to hide over $4 million in skimmed company revenue to avoid federal taxes. Marcus thought he had inherited a gold mine. He didn't realize he had inherited a liability. By signing the controlling shares over to himself, he legally assumed 100% of the company's past debts and financial fraud. My grandfather knew this. He had structured the will specifically to let Marcus walk right into the trap. At 9 a.m. on the day of the reception, I sat in my car outside the federal building in downtown Columbus. I had a coffee in one hand and the encrypted drive with 3 years of Marcus's signatures in the other. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't text the family group chat. I simply uploaded the files to the Internal Revenue Service's criminal investigation portal. Because when you're an auditor, you don't scream at the thief. You just hand the ledger to the judge. Now, let's go back to the reception. Marcus was standing near the ice sculpture, bragging to our biggest logistics client about his expansion plans. My mother was telling anyone who would listen how Marcus was the savior of the Vance legacy. Then, the heavy double doors of the ballroom opened. 2 men in dark suits walked in. They didn't look at the ice sculpture. They didn't look at the champagne. They walked straight past my mother, straight past Chloe, and stopped right in front of Marcus. The ballroom went completely silent. The only sound was the classical music playing from the speakers. "Marcus Vance?" the taller man asked. His voice was level, completely devoid of emotion. "Yes," Marcus said, his smile freezing. "We're in the middle of a private family event. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of corporate tax evasion, grand larceny, and wire fraud. Please step away from the table." My mother shrieked. Chloe dropped her glass, and it shattered against the marble floor. Marcus looked around the room, his face turning the color of old chalk. He looked at the lawyer, but Sterling was already backing away toward the exit. And then Marcus looked at me. I was standing near the coat rack, holding my glass of water. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just raised my wrist, checked the silver watch my grandfather gave me, and took a slow sip. They wanted a show. I gave them a settlement. It has been 3 months since that night. Vance Logistics went into federal receivership. Marcus is currently serving a 4-year sentence at a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, and his assets have been completely frozen to pay back taxes. My mother and Chloe had to sell the suburban mansion to cover the legal fees Marcus left behind. Last week, the federal court-appointed trustee called me. Because the company needed to be liquidated, they looked at the records to see who actually knew how to run the operation without collapsing the supply chain. They offered me the position of Chief Restructuring Officer. My office is no longer in the back by the server room. It's on the top floor, with windows that look out over the entire city. My sister texted me yesterday for the first time in 90 days. No photos of dresses, no emoji hearts, just a single sentence. "Can you lend me $3,000 for the rent? Family takes care of family." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the message, opened my main spreadsheet, and labeled the text under unrecoverable debt. I didn't reply. Some accounts are simply closed forever. Thank you for listening to tonight's story on Silent Storm Stories. If you stayed until the very end, drop the word anchor in the comments so I know who the real listeners are. Sleep well, and remember, never underestimate the person holding the pen. I spent the next 4 months living on coffee, wood dust, and the high scaffolds of Fairmont Hall. While my sister Brooke was picking out flower arrangements and arguing over the seating chart for her wedding, I was 70 feet in the air, scraping away 80 years of nicotine stains and cheap oil paint from the ballroom ceiling. My mother's warning from the kitchen hung in the air like humidity. "Don't be underfoot, Ingrid. Don't ruin the impression." Every time Grant's family, the wealthy Whitfields, walked through the hall in their tailored wool suits to check on the venue, my mother would suddenly find a reason to guide them away from my ladders. She would loudly talk over the sound of my scrapers, steering them toward the gardens. To them, I was just a contractor they hired through a company name. A girl in heavy boots and denim with wood glue under her fingernails, but working on a ceiling that old means you touch every inch of the house's history. You see the gaps where the original wood shrunk. You find the places where the builders cut corners in 1897. And on a Tuesday in late October, just 3 weeks before the wedding, my chisel hit something that didn't sound like plaster. I was working on the heavy molding right above what was going to be the main bridal head table. There was a hollow cavity behind the decorative oak leaves. When I reached my hand into the dark, my fingers brushed against a heavy tin box. It was sealed with electrical tape, thick with dust. I didn't open it on the scaffold. I waited until 9 p.m., after the grand hall went dark and the site security guard went to get his dinner. I sat under a single work light on the ballroom floor, peeled back the tape, and opened the tin. Inside were 3 things: a set of original blueprint variations for Fairmont Hall, a leather ledger belonging to Grant's grandfather from the late 80s, and 4 uncashed corporate checks made out to a company called Newell Construction, my father's old corporate name before he retired. I opened the ledger. The dates matched the exact year Abe Fletcher had restored this ballroom the first time, back in 1987. My father had always told me he retired early because of his back. He had raised us in that small house in Ohio, telling us that we were poor because the world was tough on honest carpenters. But as I read the numbers in that old ledger, the ink told a completely different story. My father hadn't retired because of his back. He had been paid a massive, silent settlement by the Whitfield family to walk away from Fairmont Hall after his apprentice, Abe Fletcher, discovered a massive structural defect in the foundation, a defect the Whitfields had hidden from the city to keep the property value from dropping. Friday morning came with a heavy autumn mist. At exactly 8:45 a.m., my secretary buzzed my inner office line. "Miss Vance, your brother's courier just dropped off a sealed envelope." I opened it. The confession was there, signed in Julian's shaky handwriting, witnessed by their family lawyer. He had broken. When the illusion of wealth is stripped away, people like Julian don't fight. They fold like cheap paper. I signed the order to cancel the bank audit and transferred Vance Salvage under the Vanguard corporate umbrella as a deactivated subsidiary. The warehouse was liquidated 3 weeks later, converted into a high-end storage facility for our boutique catering logistics. My parents were allowed to stay in their house, but the title now sits securely inside my corporate safe. Every month, my mother receives a stipend check from my accountant, just enough to cover groceries and medical insurance. No luxury crystal, no country club fees. 2 days ago, I hosted the annual Vanguard charity gala at our new downtown pavilion. It was a massive success. Arthur Winston was there, sitting at the premier table. During the main toast, he raised his glass to me and said, "To Meredith Vance, a woman who knows exactly how much it costs to keep the kitchen running." As the guests applauded, I looked down at the main entrance of the pavilion. Standing near the coat check, wearing a simple gray service uniform, was Julian. Part of his restructuring agreement under my corporate supervision required him to work 12 months in entry-level operations. He was carrying a heavy tray of empty glasses. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor so he wouldn't have to make eye contact with the people he used to play golf with. My mother was sitting in the balcony row, watching her golden boy carry dirty dishes, her eyes red with silent tears. She looked up at me, hoping for a sign of hesitation, a hint of regret. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply turned back to my table, took a slow sip of my vintage wine, and let the music drown out the past. When you spend your life being the invisible foundation, you learn a vital truth. The people who build the walls always dictate who gets to sit inside the room. Thank you for listening to tonight's full journey on Silent Storm Stories. If you stayed through every single minute of this 40-minute account, do me a final favor. Drop the word foundation in the comments below so I know who the true listeners are. Sleep well, keep your books clean, and never let anyone else dictate your place at the table.